the last week of April 1945, a three-man Soviet rifle crew dragged a long, low machine gun across a brick pile in the Tiergarten. They wedged it into a shattered doorway facing the Charlottenburger Chaussee. The gunner laid the belt. The assistant fed the first link. The third man crouched behind a tipped masonry block with another box of cartridges across his shoulders. The gun was new. 2 years earlier, it had not existed. 2 years before that, the men hauling it had been retreating across the Don in burning columns. Now they were 8 blocks from the Reich Chancellery, and the weapon they brought with them did not need water and did not need a horse cart, and it did not stop firing when a defender across the street fired back. This is the story of the Soviet SG-43 Goryunov heavy machine gun in Berlin between the 16th of April and the 2nd of May, 1945. It is the story of a rushed wartime replacement that arrived at Hitler's last address, still carrying the smell of fresh factory oil. Step back and look at the city as the Red Army saw it on the 16th of April. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's first Belarusian front was breaking out of its bridgeheads on the Oder River. Marshal Ivan Konyev's first Ukrainian front was crossing the Nysa and racing north. Inside the German capital, what remained of the Reich command was scrambling for a defense. The garrison was a patchwork. Kampfgruppe Monke held the Zitadelle, the government quarter, the Reich Chancellery itself, and the underground bunker. Fragments of the 11th SS Panzergrenadier Division Nordland fought through the boulevards. Remnants of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler clung to the edges of the central sector. French SS volunteers of the Charlemagne Division stayed and fought when they could have left. And alongside them stood the Volkssturm, the Home Guard, men in coats and armbands holding rifles older than they were. Hitler had appointed Wilhelm Monke personally as the Kampfkommandant of the Central Defense District. Monke had 2 weak regiments, roughly 2,000 men, sitting at the nerve center of the regime. They were inside the artillery cone. Soviet shells began landing on the government quarter on the 20th of April, Hitler's birthday, and never really stopped until the city surrendered 12 days later. Across the Soviet line of advance, a quiet revolution had taken place in the rifle company. The machine gun the riflemen now carried into Berlin was different from the one their fathers had carried into Petrograd. For decades, the Red Army's heavy machine gun had been the Maxim Model 1910. The Maxim was a magnificent old beast. It was water-cooled. It sat on a Sokolov wheeled mount that looked like a small artillery piece. It weighed somewhere near 65 kilograms with its full water jacket and carriage. It could fire for hours from a fixed position, and on the steppe, it ruled the open field. But the Maxim had 2 problems. It was too heavy to move quickly, and it needed a constant supply of cooling water, which froze in winter, leaked when shrapnel found the jacket, and slowed every reposition to a crawl. By the winter of 1942, after Stalingrad, the Red Army had decided enough was enough. The doctrine of the assault group, the storm group, the small detachment that pushed forward block by block, required a heavy gun that could move at the speed of the men carrying it. The answer came out of the Kovrov mechanical plant. The designer was Pyotr Maximovich Goryunov, a workshop engineer who had been quietly building a new machine gun since 1940. He worked with his nephew, Mikhail Goryunov, and the factory master, Vasily Voronkov. They called the project the GVG, after their 3 names. The trio submitted the design for field trials, watched it survive the front, and in May of 1943, the Red Army adopted it as the M1943 Goryunov machine gun. The shorthand was SG-43. The gun was a different animal from the Maxim. It was gas-operated rather than recoil-operated. It used a tilting breech block instead of the Maxim's older locking system. It fed the same 7.62 by 54 millimeter rimmed cartridge from a fabric or metal link belt at a cyclic rate of roughly 650 rounds per minute. And the change everyone could feel the moment they lifted it. No water jacket. The barrel cooled in the air. When the barrel grew too hot under sustained fire, the crew unlocked it, slid it out, and slid a fresh one in. The whole system weighed roughly half of what the Maxim weighed once the carriage was factored in. It sat on one of two mounts. The Sidorenko wheeled carriage retained the spirit of the old Sokolov wheels, low to the ground, two stubby steel wheels under the gun, easy to roll behind cover. The Degtyaryov low tripod let a crew set up on a windowsill, on a stair landing, on the inside of a cellar mouth. The wheels rolled out the front door. The tripod lifted onto the second floor. The same gun did both. By the time the spring of 1945 came, more than 80,000 Goryunov heavy machine guns had been produced and handed to the Red Army. They rode every rifle company forward. They rode the assault detachments across the Vistula. They crossed the Oder. They reached the eastern suburbs of Berlin in the third week of April. The men who carried them were not always seasoned veterans. Many had been conscripted in 1944, but the gun forgave them. It loaded simply. It cleared simply. It killed reliably. And it moved. The men holding the city had no equivalent. They had the MG-42, a faster gun, beautifully made, but produced in collapsing numbers. They had the older MG-34. They had Panzerfausts, single-shot anti-tank rockets, devastating against a tank at 30 meters and useless against a heavy machine gun 2 streets away. They had submachine guns from the Volkssturm depots that no one had cleaned in months. And they had the buildings themselves. Stone cellars, brick stairwells, attic windows that overlooked the boulevards. Their plan was to make the Soviets pay for every doorway. The Soviets brought the Goryunov to pay for it. On the morning of the 16th, the offensive opened with one of the heaviest artillery preparations of the war. Searchlights blazed across the Oder marshes. Within 48 hours, the leading Soviet rifle divisions were inside the eastern districts of Berlin. By the 23rd, the inner ring was contested. By the 25th, the city was encircled. Monkey's defenders, the Nordland remnants, the LSSAH leftovers, the Volkssturm boys, and the foreign SS volunteers were now living inside a closing fist. And inside that fist, in every Soviet assault group climbing toward the Reichstag, 3 men were carrying a long, low gun with a Sidorenko wheel under it and a fresh barrel slung across the assistant's back. The fist closed on the 25th of April. Inside Berlin, the fighting stopped being a campaign and became something else, something the men inside it could not really name. Street fighting is not really fighting. It is a slow erasure of buildings, one room at a time. And the Soviet army had a system for it. A Soviet rifle company in late April 1945 would push into a contested block in waves. The lead element was usually an assault detachment, a storm group built around submachine gunners, sappers carrying satchel charges, riflemen with grenades, and a heavy machine gun crew with an SG-43. The gun was the company's moving cover. It was the reason the assault group could close the last 20 meters to a doorway without losing every man in it. 3 men ran the gun. The gunner laid and fired. The assistant gunner carried the spare barrel and the tripod and helped traverse the weapon. The third crew member, the ammunition bearer, carried belted boxes in canvas slings and kept the feet alive. When the assault was expected to climb stairs into a fortified building, a 4th man often joined them, a runner who shuttled belts up from the regimental dump while the main crew kept firing. The doctrine was simple: pin, blind, rush. The gun crew set up behind cover with a clean lane onto an enemy firing position, usually a window, a cellar embrasure, a stairwell, or an attic opening. The gunner fired a sustained burst into the opening. The defenders inside the building dropped flat or pulled back from the slit. While they were down, a second team moved. Riflemen sprinted to the next doorway. Sappers ran a satchel charge to a wall, lit it, and ducked. Submachine gunners stacked beside the breach. The Goryunov kept hammering. When the charge blew and the assault team rushed in, the heavy guns shifted fire to the next opening, the next window, the next cellar, the next building. Then the crew picked up the gun and moved with the advance. The Maxim could not do that. The Maxim sat. The Maxim took 5 minutes to relocate. The Maxim drank water the men did not have. The SG-43 did not sit. It walked. By the 23rd of April, the 8th Guards Army of General Vasily Chuikov was driving in from the southeast. Chuikov was the man who had held Stalingrad. Stalin had personally ordered that the defenders of Stalingrad would lead the capture of Berlin, and Chuikov's army was the spear of that order. His rifle divisions ground forward through Treptow, through Neukölln, through Kreuzberg. They fought across the Teltow Canal and the Tempelhof Airport. On the 27th of April, his men and the 1st Guards Tank Army under Mikhail Katakov reached the Landwehr Canal. That canal was the last major water obstacle between them and the Reich Chancellery. The defenders on the other side of the canal were the remnants of the 11th SS Nordland. Nordland had been ordered to defend Berlin on the 16th of April. What was left of the division held a perimeter through the central sectors with 8 Tiger tanks, a handful of assault guns, and a few thousand men who had been bled at Halba and were now being bled in the city. The division's last armor was ordered into the Tiergarten itself. They were told to slow the Red Army. No one told them how. Nordland's commanders knew the math. So did Monka. So did Weidling. The Soviet ring around the city was tightening every hour. A Nordland survivor's account, preserved in the Bundesarchive, collected memoirs from the Berlin defense, captured what it felt like from inside the buildings. Russian heavy machine guns in every doorway, the survivor wrote. They fire short bursts and they never run dry, and our men cannot leave the building. Read that line again. It is the whole story of the gun in the city. They fire short bursts, they never run dry, and our men cannot leave the building. Inside a German strongpoint in a Berlin apartment block, the experience of being on the receiving end of an SG-43 was something specific. The cyclic rate of 650 rounds per minute meant a burst of 6 rounds came at you in roughly half a second. The crack of 7.62 rimmed against masonry filled the stairwell. Plaster fell from the ceilings. Window frames blew apart. The defenders who tried to lean into a sight picture were knocked back, or worse. The men who waited for the burst to end and then leaned forward found that the next burst came 8 seconds later, then 6 seconds later, then continuously, because the Soviet crew had a fresh belt loaded. The barrel was getting hot. Maxim crews would have to stop and check the water. Goryunov crews unlocked the latch, slid the hot barrel out, slid a cold one in, and kept firing. The Volkssturm folded fastest. The Home Guard had no doctrine for sustained heavy machine gun fire. The men of the Volkssturm had been issued a rifle and a Panzerfaust and told to defend their street. Within hours of meeting a real Soviet assault group with a Goryunov section, most Volkssturm positions had either surrendered, fled, or stopped firing because their riflemen were down. The Soviet rifle company would walk through the block. The defenders left behind would either come out with their hands up or stay in the cellar and wait to be sapped out. The Nordland fighters lasted longer. The French Charlemagne volunteers lasted longer still. These men had nowhere to go and nothing to surrender to. But longer is a relative word. By the 27th of April, the central core of the Nordland Division had been pushed back into Defense Sector Z, the central government district. Their tanks were burning in the Tiergarten. Their assault guns were dug into the rubble around the zoo. Their commanders were running between positions on foot because the streets were too dangerous for vehicles. While they retreated, the Goryunov teams advanced. The wheeled Sidorenko mount rolled across smashed cobblestones. The crew leaned the wheels backward and pulled the gun over a curb. Inside a captured apartment block, The assistant lifted the tripod up a stairwell, set the legs, and the gunner brought the weapon up behind him. From a third-story window in a Mitte tenement, the gun could rake a courtyard 4 buildings away. From a cellar mouth across an intersection, it could put a sustained beaten zone onto any defender who tried to cross. Every Soviet rifle squad pushing into Mitte, into the approaches to the Reichstag, into the streets feeding toward the Brandenburg Gate, had at least one SG-43 working with it. Often 2, sometimes 3 guns sighted in overlapping cones of fire. The First Belarusian Front's small arms expenditure reports for the final 2 weeks of the war recorded ammunition use in the millions of rounds. A meaningful share of that came out of Goryunov belts. The defenders were not out of options. They still had rooftops. They still had attics. They still had Panzerfausts that could blow open a wall. But the Panzerfaust was a 30-meter weapon. The Goryunov was a 600-meter weapon. The math was bad. Every minute that math kept compounding. And on the night of the 27th of April, the 8th Guards Army crossed the Landwehr Canal. The men of Stalingrad were now 800 meters from the Führer bunker. The gun crews crossed with them. 800 meters. In an open field, 800 meters is a 5-minute walk. In central Berlin, in the last week of April 1945, 800 meters was the distance between life and the end of a war. Across the canal, the city's center had compressed into a perimeter the Germans called Defense Sector Z, the central government district, the Citadel. Inside that perimeter was Wilhelm Mohnke and his Kampfgruppe. Inside that perimeter was the Reich Chancellery. Inside that perimeter, 2 floors underground, was the Führer bunker. The math from the outside was simple. Soviet forces around Berlin numbered roughly 1.5 million men. Mohnke had 2 weak regiments, about 2,000 soldiers in total. The combined defense of the city, including General Helmuth Weidling's 56th Panzer Corps and the surviving Nordland fragments and the Volkssturm, came to perhaps 85,000 defenders. Even at the start of the battle, the ratio was bad. By the 28th of April, the ratio was a sentence the defenders no longer finished. Mohnke had been put in command of the Citadel directly by Hitler. He had a strange independence inside the city's command structure. Although Weidling was the defense commandant of Berlin, Mohnke remained outside Weidling's authority. His job was simple: defend the Reich Chancellery, defend the Führer bunker, defend the buildings around them, block by block, until ordered otherwise. The Soviet attack that closed on the Citadel came from multiple directions at once. Chuikov's 8th Guards Army pushed from the south. The 3rd Shock Army drove from the north toward the Reichstag. The 5th Shock Army worked through Friedrichshain and Mitte. Heavy artillery pounded the government quarter without pause from the 20th of April onward. The Air Ministry building on Wilhelmstrasse, the seat of the Luftwaffe's old prestige, was being walked into by Soviet field guns firing at point-blank range. And in the windows of every captured building facing the government quarter, a Goryunov gun crew was sighted. The Soviet method in the final week was attritional, methodical, and patient. Sappers and assault detachments would clear a block. The heavy machine guns would be carried up to the highest covered position with a clean line to the next block. Then the next assault would push, again, with a Goryunov section providing the suppressive fire that bought the rifleman his last 20 meters. The defenders inside the Citadel did not collapse all at once. They collapsed in pieces. A doorway here, a cellar there, an attic across a street that suddenly went silent because the men inside it had stopped firing back. A Nordland soldier in the central government quarter on the 28th of April would have heard a constant overlapping rhythm of automatic fire. Short, controlled bursts. 6 rounds, 8 rounds, then a pause. Then another burst from a different building. Then a third burst from across the avenue. The Goryunov crews did not waste belts. They fired short. They moved often. They never gave the defenders a long target to range against.
The first Belarusian front operational summaries for the Tiergarten and government quarter fighting from the 26th of April to the 2nd of May recorded thousands of German dead in the urban defensive belt.
The Rifle Division after-action reports credited Goryunov's fire with breaking SS counterattacks before they could close. Volkssturm positions folded under sustained machine gun fire within hours of contact. By the 30th of April, the Soviet flag was being fought up the steps of the Reichstag. The fighting inside that building was room by room, floor by floor. Adolf Hitler died in the bunker that afternoon. Mohnke held the chancellery for another day and a half. Nordland fought from cellars under collapsed buildings. Charlemagne held one of the last positions near the chancellery into the early hours of the 2nd of May. That morning, the 2nd of May, 1945, General Helmut Weidling was brought through the Soviet lines under a white flag. At 23 minutes past 8 in the morning, he was sitting in front of General Vasily Chuikov. The man who had held Stalingrad 3 years earlier was about to accept the surrender of Berlin. Weidling signed the order. The garrison was to lay down its arms. The fighting was over. Mohnke and his staff tried to break out of the bunker in small groups and were eventually captured. Berlin belonged to the Red Army. Walk back through what made this possible. The defenders of Berlin had everything a defense needs. They had stone buildings. They had elevated firing positions. They had short ranges. They had men prepared to die in place. They had the Tiger tank, the MG-42, the Panzerfaust, and the city itself. What they did not have was an answer to a Soviet rifle company that could carry its heavy machine gun up a staircase in 2 minutes and put 1,000 rounds through a window in 3. The Goryunov did not win the battle by itself. The artillery won the battle. The tanks won the battle. The 2.5 million Soviet soldiers across the broader Berlin operation won the battle. But inside the city, in the narrow lanes of Mitte and Tiergarten, the heavy machine gun that the Red Army had rushed into service 2 years earlier was the weapon doing the close work. It was the gun in the doorway. It was the gun on the windowsill. It was the gun a defender across the street could not silence because his Panzerfaust would not reach, and his MG-42 had jammed an hour ago. The story did not end on the 2nd of May. The SG-43 went home with the Red Army. 2 designers, Alexander Zaitsev and a young engineer named Mikhail Kalashnikov, took the weapon apart in the immediate post-war years and modernized it. They improved the barrel. They refined the receiver. They adjusted the mount. The new gun was designated the SGM, the modernized Goryunov. The Soviet Union built the SGM continuously from 1945 through 1968. It went to North Korea. It went to North Vietnam. It went into Soviet-aligned armies across Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. It was carried over the same ground that Maxim guns had once dominated, and held those positions for another generation. Today, the original SG-43 is a museum piece. The SGM is mostly retired from frontline service, but the design lineage runs straight through every belt-fed Soviet heavy machine gun that came after it. The PK family of machine guns, the Soviet general-purpose machine guns that have served from the 1960s to the present day, are descended in spirit from the work Pyotr Goryunov and his nephew did at Kovrov between 1940 and 1943. That is the strange thing about emergency weapons. The Red Army built the SG-43 because it could not afford to build a better Maxim. It needed something lighter, simpler, cheaper, and faster to put on the line. The result was a gun that lived 4 decades past the emergency that produced it. And in the doorway of a smashed apartment block in central Berlin, on the night of the 1st of May, 1945, 3 young Soviet soldiers were sitting beside their gun. The fighting in their sector had quieted. The Reichstag had fallen. Somewhere underground, the men who had built the war that destroyed half of Europe were finishing themselves with pistols. The assistant gunner was eating a piece of black bread. The ammunition bearer was asleep against the wall, and the gunner was running his hand along the barrel of an SG-43 Goryunov heavy machine gun, the air-cooled, gas-operated, quick-change barrel weapon that had walked with him from the Vistula to the center of Berlin, and he was waiting for the order to move it again. The order to move it again did not come. The war was over.